the Alliance for Climate Resilient Earth, ACRE. That'll be the last time you hear me say Alliance for Climate Resilient Earth. Just call it ACRE. I'm going to give you a brief description of ACRE once we get everybody introduced. And we have a very unique panel that's going to be talking about the idea of the private sector and what role that the private sector plays in innovation. And so why don't we just do self-introductions, because you describe yourself better than anybody except for their parole officer. So we'll start with Al over there.
Sure. I realized this morning I didn't actually introduce myself. So my name is Al Cho. I'm our Chief Strategy and External Affairs Officer here at Xylem. Before working at Xylem, I was at the State Department, working on issues not too dissimilar from this.
And we've got such an array of talent in the room. And when we began setting this whole session up, we knew that was going to happen. So what we really like to think is, and I know that Josh talked about the idea at the front end of what an outcome of this will be. And you can just look at it from the program that you have in front of you, that we're not here just to sit here and say, woe is us. We're not here to say, well, somebody's got to do something about something. We're here to say, what is it that we can identify as being top 5 or how many ever we come up with at the end of the day, challenges about how water is so critical as we think about climate resilience. And then on the second day, obviously, it's the idea, what are we going to do about it? And so what are we going to do about it? It's not only you have to think about what the challenges are, but you also have to think about the idea of there's something that is going to go on or those challenges are going to get worse. And so what I thought might be useful is I've had several people ask me to actually do this. And so the question is, what is acre? Well, for those of you who are mathematical, acre is 43,560 square feet. Any other questions? No, it's acre is very new. We are about 29 months old. From a practical standpoint, we were formed on kind of January the 29th, 2020 at the Stimson Center when about 30 organizations came together to form us. We were officially launched on Earth Day of 2020. And so in those 28, 29 months, we've become the largest climate resilience alliance organization on the planet. We're about 165 members. We're growing exponentially fast. I was telling Nicole that Friday, we got as a member the National Water Center in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. We have out of those 165 or so, we've got 25 universities, and worldwide we have some of the largest corporations on earth like Lockheed Martin and Siemens and all 10 of the largest engineering firms in the world. And there are a lot of ACRE members that are here in this audience, like Deloitte and Black & Veatch was an original founding member, and Xylem and Suez. But we also are very fortunate to have, we're the only organization in the world that has 8 national labs as founding members. So our capabilities of reaching out to those 8, and those are the 8 national labs that are DOE labs, but also they have earth science programs. So there's a water component in those 8 national labs. So one of the things that's kind of interesting is the idea of who joins Acre is kind of as we look at it month by month, it's a very interesting look at what are the hot button items right now. And so what do you think are the most joiners in the last month? Water. That's really unique, I think, because it's a and then the second most, what's the most hot button item? We have, if you look on the Acre webpage, you'll see that we have 8 areas of focus, and they are areas of focus like water, infrastructure, finance, insurance and reinsurance. And then there's a food and ag area of focus. What's really interesting, food and ag's number 2. Now, why do you think that is? Because we're looking down the throat of maybe one of the worst famines ever to hit the earth in the next year. And so because of the situation in Ukraine, I do want to, because he just stepped in the room, I do want to call out Jan Hartke. And Jan, raise your hand back there. Jan's the chairman of Acre, and he and I and a lady who you'll meet later on this afternoon by the name of Elise Zoli got together and started this crazy thing. So that's a little bit about Acre. We want all of you to join. No individuals or members of Acre, all your organizations. So we'd love for all of your organizations you represent to be Acre members. So with that, let's hand the mic back over to, let's just start with Al. And then Al, talk a little bit about what Xylem sees on a daily basis as saying, how does your business relate to the challenges that you see popping up every day? And how does a private sector entity say, we got this coming down the pike, how are we going to face it?
Sure. Thanks very much, Stan. And welcome again, everyone. I prepared a couple of pages just to ground the discussion. Some of it will be things that you're all very familiar with, and some of it might be new. So yeah, okay, great. And what I've tried to do is actually elevate this a little bit away from the perspective of a single company to think a little bit more about what is the private sector's role in addressing some of the challenges that we've been talking about today. So David, if you wouldn't mind helping me with the screen. There we go. So I wanted to cover kind of 3 high-level messages today. The first is that water resilience isn't principally a technology issue. It's an issue of economics, policy, and culture. And we'll talk about what that means in practice in a moment. Another is that the challenges for resilience look very different across the water cycle. The nature of the challenge around the water scarcity issue that Nathan was describing a little earlier is a very different challenge ontologically than the problem of flood risk and sea level rise. And then ultimately, the role of the private sector isn't one in isolation. It's in dialogue with other stakeholders in the sector around the role we can play around developing and changing the economics of the resilience challenge. So here's some slides that you can play a little bit of resilience bingo. If we had drinks here, you could take a drink. Everyone mentioned some of these statistics because they're very familiar. But there are a lot of organizations that have done a very good job of translating the work of the IPCC into things that people can digest. And the fact is that 1.5 degrees of warming, there's a 50% chance, according to the most recent reports, that we're going to hit that in the next 5 years, which is crazy. And the problem is that if we're already at 1.5, the prospects of getting to 2 very quickly are pretty high. We've already locked in a level of emissions that gets us very close to uncomfortable territory. And as you can see, the amplification and the multiplication of the impacts is very significant when you move from 1.5 to 2 degrees. It just gets worse and worse and worse, 2 to 3 times as bad along many indicators, 10 times worse on others. And as you can see from these categories of impacts, whether it's on biodiversity or on ecosystems, those impacts, almost all of them have some relation to the management of the water cycle. And that's really why we convened this discussion today. So here's a chart, McKinsey put this together just around where we are with respect to emission trends, where the pathways need to look like in order for us to get to the different degrees of warming that are projected in the IPCC report. And the bad news is right now, the current trends are basically to get to a 3.5 degree warming trajectory, when we all know that bad is 1.5 and really bad would be staying on a historical trajectory, which would get us to 5 degrees of warming by 2100. So if you bring those two charts together, we're on the precipice of being at a trajectory that is far worse than the 2 degree scenario that we're just outlining there. And to change that trajectory would require a very radical degree of decarbonization that most of us don't see right on the immediate horizon. And so all of that means that resilience becomes more and more important, because some of the warming that we see is likely unavoidable and therefore needs to be better managed. So this is just one more chart on mitigation, and then we'll kind of switch. This is just to look at some of the pathways that are required in order to achieve that 1.5 degree trajectory. It basically requires very, very significant net reductions of emissions over the course of the next 5 years or 8 years now, because it's already 2022. It requires us getting to net zero by 2050, and then pretty significant mitigation of non-CO2 greenhouse gases, things like methane, N2O, et cetera. I'm sure none of this is a surprise to you, so I'm going to keep moving. So if we are all aligned there that we're on a trajectory to a degree of warming that is going to set in motion a series of water-related challenges that we are going to need to manage differently, what I wanted to do is put this in the perspective of water management, right? Water management is all about transforming variable inputs into low variance outcomes. Anyone here, I know we have Matt from DC Water, others who have utility experience, are in a very challenging situation of taking whatever nature gives us and turning it into what comes out of the tap when you kind of move your faucet from left to right. Utilities are tasked with taking very high variability inputs like rainfall, influent quality, input prices, energy prices, et cetera, and random failure rates of the infrastructure that's used to deliver outcomes, and to use very stable, long-lived infrastructure assets in order to deliver very, very low variance outcomes. And so there's this transformation of risk that has to happen in order for us to live within the parameters that human beings like to live in from a water perspective. We have pretty tight tolerances when it comes to water availability. Our agroecological systems have evolved to live within pretty narrow bands of water availability. And so that task, whether it's a utility or any other kind of water manager, in terms of transforming randomness into stability using brittle and long-lived processes, whether that's infrastructure that we've built that lasts for 30 years, or people that we recruit who stay for 30 years, or regulations that when implemented last for 30 years, all of those things make it very difficult for this balancing act to happen every single day. And the nature of the random and discontinuous shifts that we're beginning to see in the climate will make this balancing act progressively more challenging. And that's what the name of resilience is all about in the water sector. This is just a snapshot, because I want to then move to the issue of water scarcity, because one of the things that is projected in a lot of the work that's been done on the impacts of climate change is that there are a number of regions in the world that are going to move from a situation of being water marginal to being water scarce over the course of the next couple of decades. And one of the things that I want to reorient us around this issue of water scarcity as a principal dimension of resilience in the water sector is that water scarcity isn't fundamentally an issue of technology, it's an issue of economics and behavior. So there's almost always enough water somewhere in the world in order to supply us all with fresh, clean water. It's just very, very expensive. It's very expensive to move it from where it is to where it isn't. How many of you who work in water have a friend who's like, well, why don't we just build a pipeline that takes all of the water from the eastern US to the western US? And you're like, well, because water is heavy, right? And that's a difficult thing to do. But in principle, those things are possible. It's just very, very expensive. And a cost curve helps us think about this as a framework for making decisions about addressing this particular dimension of resilience. So this is an example. It's the Water Resources Group 2030. The 2030 Water Resources Group, I think now lives out of the World Bank. And what they did was to look at a basin by basin scan of how do we look at the projected needs in 2030 and how might we close the gap between where we are now and where we are going to be in the future. And they look at all of these different interventions, look at how big those interventions could be in terms of acre feet of water and how much they would cost in order to implement. And if you've ever seen a greenhouse gas mitigation marginal abatement cost curve, it looks a lot like this. There's a lot of stuff on the left, which is negative cost. It just means that by being more efficient, tackling the kinds of interventions that Nathan was talking about earlier, using sensors, meters, leak detection technologies, there are negative cost interventions which save people money and improve water availability in a given watershed. And so there's things we have to go get after, right? Those technologies exist. So what explains their persistence? That's why fundamentally a big part of the issue around resilience is about culture, incentives, and behavior. It's about having buildings install more water efficient fixtures. It's about enabling utilities to eliminate leaks in the distribution and transmission network. And it's about sending signals to consumers to do things like not run the tap when they're brushing their teeth, or to fix leaks on the customer side of the meter. Those are the kinds of technologies that at negative cost improve net water supply in a given watershed. And we need smarter and better policies, incentives, and behavioral interventions in order to drive capture of those water savings. Then there's a bunch of infrastructure-oriented technologies that can actually help us move water supply further to the right. Those things include things like rainwater harvesting on rooftops, or different kinds of groundwater pumping, mulching in agriculture. Right? There are a lot of different things that can happen across an ecosystem that expand availability. The challenge from a resilience perspective is not that interventions don't exist or that we need a lot of new technology. It's that economics and behavioral change are the big constraint, and that this cost curve is dynamic. One of the challenges you'll see is that there's a very steep ramp over here, right? So that there's a point that after you've exhausted a lot of the lower cost interventions to expand water supply, that moving to desalination, for example, gets very, very expensive because it costs a lot of energy and capital equipment to build plants that can effectively separate salt ions from water. And so the more that we can do to do two things: first, capture lower cost interventions, and then second, over time, use new technologies to lower the cost of different interventions that are here on the right-hand side of the chart. That enables us to address scarcity challenges at a very high level in a less expensive, more affordable, more accessible, and ultimately more equitable way. So that's just one framework I want to leave us with, is that on the scarcity side, it's not fundamentally an issue of technology, it's an issue of economics, behavior, culture, and incentives. On the resilient side, it's a slightly different story, because you can't necessarily just think about that as a cost curve. When we talk about things like sea level rise, inundation, hurricanes, natural disasters, et cetera, we're talking about expected loss reduction and risk transfer. And so the frame is not just a cost curve, it's actually thinking about how do we lower probabilistic risk and shift those risks and transfer the risks that we can't manage. One of the most cost-effective ways to do that, just if you look at it from a benefit cost ratio perspective, is strengthening early warning systems. That's going to be a big theme, I think, throughout the discussions that we have. That information that helps us predict and alert people, communities, to incoming risks is one of the best ways to allow them to increase their own adaptive capacity, whether it's a flood or some other natural disaster. But investment in these things are not sufficient today. And then there are a number of other types of investments that can be made. Risk transfer is another important tool here. Catastrophic risk, modeling of catastrophic outcomes. And so when Stan was talking about the insurance community in the private sector, that's another big kind of role to play here. So I want to talk about two general things that need to happen as we think about the interplay between the private sector and the public sector in driving resilience. One observation that I'd like to make is that over the last couple of decades, we've seen a pretty pronounced decline in the number of continuously reporting stream gauges, precipitation monitors, and other instruments that are used by public agencies to monitor in situ hydrological conditions. Right, so this is data that we commissioned a study by the Nicholas Institute at Duke a couple of years ago to look at USGS and World Meteorological Organization data around how much of a continuous record is there? How good is the spatial and temporal resolution of the data sets that we're collecting around the world around critical hydrological parameters? Yes, it's true that there's been an improvement in remote sensing over this period, but the fact is that there is no replacement for a continuously operating hydrological monitoring network. And whether it's in the United States or globally, we've actually seen a very significant decline in public funding and operation of stream gauge networks and other precipitation monitoring networks that will help us understand long-term change and real-time conditions in water. And that's just not okay. So one of the things that have to happen in order to create greater resilience is ongoing sustained investment in the kinds of networks that give us data about our water. The good news is that there are some things that are happening that leverage fusion of data. This is one of the things Nathan was talking about. And I wanted to call this out as one example. How many of you have read a book called Building a Resilient Tomorrow? I was just talking to Nicole about this over the break. It's by Alice Hill from the National Security Council under the Obama administration, and Leonardo Martinez Diaz, who is the DAS at Treasury working on climate under the Obama administration. And they wrote this really interesting book that looked at what are some of the interventions that are critical. Oh, Jan's read it. What are some of the critical interventions that are required in order to fuel public and private sector innovation in water? And one of the observations they made is look at the example of catastrophe risk modeling. And think about a small town in Georgia where they talked to a mayor who's on the coast. And she was like, I'd really love to be able to understand what sea level rise is going to look like. But I don't have a team of people who can help me downscale and understand climate risk. I don't have a team of people who can help me understand all of these things. There's not really easy way for me to get access to risk modeling. And you contrast that with the fact that there's this huge profusion of remote sensing data, of a lot of other applications that have been created in every other sector of the economy. But a lot of the catastrophe models that exist are being used right now privately. There are people who are building startups and applications that ultimately don't make that information accessible for end users that are like this mayor in Georgia. So I wanted to bring up this example. It's a completely different example, but one that is, I think, relevant because it's an institutional model that is interesting. This is called OpenET. How many of you have heard of OpenET? Okay, a lot of you have. So let me draw out the examples of why OpenET is interesting. First, the problem it's trying to solve is that when we're modeling the hydrological cycle and trying to define things like irrigation scheduling, we need to know how much evapotranspiration is happening, right, in a field or at the basin scale. And until recently, that was a very difficult thing to know, right? There are these things called weighing lysimeters, where you can basically weigh crops, how much water they're taking up, how much water you've put in, and try to derive from that a measure of evapotranspiration. But it's very, very expensive to do, right? There are people who build evapotranspiration models, people who build these data sets, but that data has, until recently, been very expensive to access. So what OpenET has tried to do, and this has been funded by foundations, is to create a spatially continuous, time series oriented view of evapotranspiration that is publicly accessible to anybody using transparent and ensemble based models. So there's a lot there. But what they've done is to say, with some money from government and from foundation sources, they can take all of the satellite data that's coming in from NOAA, from NASA, from the European Space Agency, ground truth it with certain hydrological indicators, and come up with some estimate for how much evapotranspiration is happening on every 30 by 30 pixel in the Western United States. And they can backscale that all the way back to 1984. And they make it available. You can choose which evapotranspiration models you want to use, or you can run the ensemble. And it basically creates a public good out of this data. So what's interesting about that from a resilience perspective? Well, first of all, the direct application for publicly available evapotranspiration data is of immense relevance to the Western US, right? So if that data is available, all of a sudden at a basin level, there are all kinds of things you can do to optimize irrigation management, forestry management, and other land use management plans to do a lot more with less water. And so OpenET, from that perspective, could be a very useful way to improve the water efficiency of the Western US. But more fundamentally, I think there's an institutional question here, which is this data is the kind of data that could be very useful to provide as a public good fabric that would enable a lot of private sector innovation in terms of resilience related data. So catastrophe modeling is a great example of an area where there's a lot of individual models, a lot of data which is being ingested privately, which if made publicly available in an ensemble format where people could get real-time data and there's at least some basic level of information that could be provided in a spatially continuous and temporally kind of real-time fashion, you would be able to enable and equip people to do a lot more with their own planning efforts. Nicole mentioned a lot that's been happening in federal provision of this data. And for example, there's this climate resilience toolkit. So I have an observation here, which is in that book, Building a Resilience Tomorrow, they point out an observation that I think is dead on, which is that federal agencies are actually really good at providing data sets, which are universal and inclusive and very useful, but they're not as good at providing kind of the retail part, which is the viewers, the front end applications in a way that's very useful for folks all around the world. So the last analogy I want to leave you with is the app that you probably have on your phone called Waze. Right? Waze is a platform that ingests a lot of publicly available and non-publicly available data to create an app that is useful for you that probably no public agency could have built if they were trying to think about it from the perspective of just providing data. And so what I want to think about here is just how can we think about the role of what data can be made publicly available to fuel platforming, which is then very useful for end users to have on their phones or have in their cities, where someone else is doing integration work and creating applications that are useful from a resilience perspective. Because the fundamental challenge here, and I think Stan, you might have brought this up, or Sally in the morning, is that while it's actually reasonably easy to pump out data, which is rigorous and audited and is continuous, it's much more difficult for a centralized organization to think about how to create useful end user applications. And so there needs to be some thought around how do we ensure that publicly available information is aggregated in ways that are useful to end users by private and nonprofit sector organizations, but in ways that fundamentally address, there is one more page, or maybe not, fundamentally address some of the boundary challenges around resilience, which if I just go back to the first page, I think are there. So at the end of the day, private sector entities can address a number of resilience challenges with existing technologies. If you think about water scarcity, water reuse technologies exist today, which if universally implemented would dramatically improve the overall availability of water supply in many cities around the United States and around the world. And the one area where I would modify what Nathan says is I actually think it's technologically possible to get water that is recycled and reused to just as good of a condition as mountain spring water. It's technically possible. Sometimes it's not implemented that way. So that's one message from a technology perspective. We can implement networks of technologies like advanced metering infrastructure and network optimization tools, which reduce leakage very significantly. And there are some institutional issues that need to be put into place in order to make those available through SRFs and state infrastructure funds, as Nathan was saying. But fundamentally, I think if we think about resilience as an area where we want to drive more investment and more technology adoption as opposed to just technology innovation, we've got to address a couple of core issues. The first is around the fact that there are some behavioral economics biases here where communities haven't yet decided that they want to take on this investment challenge. There's availability bias and all kinds of other cognitive biases around whether people really think this is enough of a problem to guide investment. And that's leading to an underinvestment in technologies, which if implemented today, would actually create a lot more benefit in the future. One and second area is that in terms of regulation and in terms of market signals, there are a number, particularly in water reuse, of regulations which are making it more expensive to implement technologies because they are technology-based rather than outcome-based. And one of the moves that we can make in the water sector is to say, here's the outcome we need you to deliver, do it more as cheaply and as reliably as possible, rather than specifying that you need to use a particular treatment train, which won't be applicable in every circumstance. A third area is, again, this issue of where can we invest in public goods that will make it cheaper for the private sector to implement technologies that will address decentralized resilience challenges. And that's an example of OpenET. It's an example of where a lot of the drought monitor data, for example, as limited as it is, does create an information platform that other people can build on. And then lastly is when we think about that, and we're asking people to build applications which contribute to resilience, how do we create either an incentive for or a marketplace for things that are universal in nature, so that we're not only creating applications and services for people who can afford them, but like Waze work in rural areas almost as well as they do in densely populated urban areas? How do we make sure that we're crowding in innovation that addresses equity challenges from the get-go? So those are just some high-level observations. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Stan. That's correct. I don't. If you look at the agenda, actually, you'll see a name of my colleague, Zainab Ardal. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to travel from California because of the flight cancellations. So she reached out to me just yesterday, told me about this, and I agreed to fill in for her. So as you can tell, I'm overdressed, underprepared, probably underprepared, but we'll see how we do. So Stan, that's correct. My background is in civil engineering. I work for Black & Veatch, so we are heavily involved in the critical human infrastructure, including water, wastewater, energy, telecom, all of those very critical things that make cities work. And so I'll be talking from an engineering perspective and also from the private sector perspective. We actually, personally, I just finished a project with Water Research Foundation focused on infrastructure resilience. So I could talk about resilience for hours, actually, if you let me. But I'll keep this focused. I believe the ask is understanding the challenges we face. So I'll try to keep focused on the challenges for us to think about. So let me start with a comment that Nicole made this morning. So she talked about aging infrastructure. So I was thinking about that. That's a very valid comment. To make it more practical, I guess most people are local here, maybe some are not, but the water supply system that's serving the DC area. So there are a couple of intakes up on the Potomac River, Great Falls, Little Falls. There's a tunnel conveyance system that takes water from that location and brings it into DC. It's a system that was designed and built more than 100 years ago. And there are a couple of water treatment plants that treat that water to drinking water standards. Those treatment plants are more than 50 years ago. And Matt can correct me with these numbers if I'm misspeaking here. In terms of the distribution network, I was reading just yesterday, the median age of the pipes, the water mains that DC Water operates is 77 years, right? So we are operating a very old infrastructure, generally, more so in the East Coast, but generally across the US. So I have really two messages from that. One is there is what we call as deferred maintenance. Utilities are really faced with deferred maintenance and deferred rehab and replacement needs. So this has been carried for a long time due to funding maybe limitations or capacity to implement these projects. We are still carrying a very big backlog of improvement needs because to be able to address the aging infrastructure issue. So the upside of that is, I think it's fair to point out that these systems are still operational, right? Built, designed, and built 100 years ago. These are still operational. So in the water civil engineering sector, that's the challenge. I mean, it sounds maybe very difficult, but when we design a dam or a water supply system, we have to think about the next 50 years, 100 years, maybe 200 years. And so we need to design systems that are ready for population changes, demand changes, technology changes, asset reliability deterioration. We need to figure out how to take out a piece of facility, piece of asset, and then put it back into service. So traditionally, the civil engineering system community is pretty good at planning for the long term, planning for uncertainty, managing uncertainty, and developing designs that deal with those things. So that's the first challenge: the aging infrastructure and the nature of the water cycle. Having to deal with long time frames, we tend to slow. We tend to move slowly, right? So, in a way, the long time frames, being able to plan for long time frames is a good thing. It's a very important thing. But the flip side of that is that we are a bit of a conservative sector. It takes time to change and adopt new technologies and so forth. So that's one. The second challenge that I can think of is was pointed out earlier, several times, the segmentation of the sector. So maybe partly because drinking water and clean water, drinking water and wastewater are governed by two different acts. The drinking water infrastructure and wastewater infrastructure have developed somewhat separately. And so we are talking about one water more and more. We are talking about integrated planning, catchment level planning more and more. So we're recognizing that it is one water cycle. We can't really think of drinking water in isolation or wastewater in isolation. So I think there is progress there. But then also we are really seeing additional evidence about the interdependence of different types of infrastructure. Water energy nexus, we talk about that. Last year, the cold freeze in Texas really was a stark reminder of how interdependent water systems are with power supply. And so we are beginning to see those interdependencies a lot better and more frequently. Beyond that, we need to be moving towards, from a facility or systems point of view, we need to be thinking in terms of systems, integrated systems, and system of systems. And so, and then breaking down that segmentation that we currently have. That was going to be my third challenge to point out. Next one is communication. So the resilience study that I was just mentioning a minute ago, we looked at resilience, many different definitions of resilience, and we were also noticing the evolution of the definition itself. In the earlier definitions, you can see a response and recovery focus. So how do we deal with disruptions and recover as quickly as possible was really the focus of resilience. More recent definitions of resilience really talk about adaptive capacity, right? And so we're sort of recognizing that disruptive events are here to stay, that they will be more common. And so how do we build adaptive capacity to adapt to those disruptions, which are becoming more and more common? And so the definition of resilience is changing. And I think even in the engineering industry, there's a lot of confusion on what resilience means. It will mean very different things in different contexts. I think that's okay. But when we talk about resilience, sustainability, I think there is a need for being more clear, more consistent with our messaging. Going back to 30 years or so, we used to talk about global warming, right? And the debate was, well, is it real? Is it natural? Is it human induced? Hopefully we've gone beyond that discussion. Now we're talking about climate change. I believe globally climate crisis is more commonly used these days. So I think there's a real need to highlight the urgency that we're facing and be clear in our communications. I think it is probably fair to say the wider public doesn't look at this as an urgent issue, right? I guess most of us think of this as a slow burning issue. We don't really see it as an existential threat. But one of the examples that I gave to my son is, what is sustainability? What is resilience? I said, sustainability is the real challenge, and resilience is really the wake-up call because we haven't acted on the sustainability challenge. So resilience and sustainability, we need to think in parallel paths about them both, and we need to be highlighting the urgency to act. So I really love the culture and then the focus on action here that I heard this morning. Final challenge I'm gonna highlight is funding. So I was listening to a TED talk the other day by Yuval Harari. You may have read some of his books, but he was basically saying, his team went through a lot of research, and he was looking for, what would it take? How much would it cost to avoid climate disaster? And his conclusion was that a lot of the research was really converging around a number, which is 2% of our GDP, 2% of the world's GDP. So that's the level of investment we need to dedicate to resilience, risk mitigation, clean technologies. Yeah, we need to identify where that money comes from. And then I think the engineering community is very efficient in assessing priorities, finding solutions, following a strategy and implementing that strategy. I guess really the gap is communicating the urgency of climate resilience, dedicating resources and leadership to this issue. I guess I'll stop there.
All right, so here comes the fun part. You want to put them on the spot? Yeah, let's do that. Okay. So I'm gonna just throw out something. What's the biggest? And everybody just say it whenever first thing hits your mind. What's the biggest organization on the planet? And you might say, okay, in what sector? All right, so the private sector. It's Amazon. Yeah, in terms of bigness. Another one. What's another one? And don't say Tesla, it's actually not. What's another one? Just randomly. What's that? Apple? Alibaba is probably number three or something like that. Are they big? Yeah. Are they capable? Yeah. Are they capable of making a dent in this deal? And the answer is no, not by themselves. However, it's kind of the premise of Acre. What if you could take some real giants and put them together and create partnerships where the conglomeration or the partnerships of those 5, 6, 7, 8 really big partners that come together, can they make a dent if they all band together instead of trying to do this thing by themselves? So here's the on the spot part, and that is both these guys in the private sector, have you had some conversations in your companies about the idea maybe we got to figure out a different mousetrap for this deal because of the fact that we're not big enough to do it? So partnerships are a wave of the future. So if you could kind of, because I know that engineering companies are famous for it, and of saying, we can do it because we've got all the talent, but we know that we can't, and because the problems are too big. So if you could just say, is the paradigm changing to where Xylem, for example, is going to say, we need to get somebody else to help us with X, Y, and Z, where we would have tried to do it ourselves in the past, or Black and Veatch. I know that you guys have some really interesting partnerships at Black and Veatch, and that's one of the reasons that I picked them, because they've got actually Xylem and Black and Veatch works together on a partnership. So just address that a little bit. That's kind of the practical side of where the private sector's got to go if we're going to be successful at hitting this thing on the head.
I'll just jump in real quick, and I'll keep it brief because I think we only have a few minutes, and I want to make sure we get some questions from the floor as well. But the answer is absolutely. I mean, this is a challenge that's too big for any company. We have partnerships with a number of the tech companies, including Esri, with community organizations, et cetera, in order to drive innovation that happens outside of the four walls of our company. We have an innovation labs effort, which invests in startups that have solutions to a number of resilience-related challenges in the water sector. And we're one of the sponsors with Isle Utilities, which is a kind of water sector convener around challenges and technologies to drive net zero and decarbonization in the water sector. So I think one of the shifts that you will see is exactly what Stan noted, which is this is a problem that is so large in magnitude that no company can solve it. No company also can own it. And so I think it should drive a different degree of partnership and a different posture toward innovation.
So let me start with the insight and then go out to partnerships. So we recently, maybe it was last year, we published this sustainability policy for the company, and it took a while for us to get there. Okay, it took a lot of internal debate, discussions, workshops, and so forth. Part of the reason is all of us understand sustainability. You know, that we need to do something at the local level. But at the same time, Black & Veatch also operates in the power energy sectors, oil and gas sector. So that's part of our operation as well. We build power plants, and so how do we work that in? So it took a while, but I mean, along the process we recognized we had to make some hard choices. In the end, the strategy said, you know, we're getting out of coal. We're not doing any more work in the coal industry, right? So that's a big business decision. And along with that, there are a lot of additional strategies that help us, you know, measure our carbon footprint and monitor that and reduce that over a period of time. As part of the water wastewater operations, we have an innovation incubator program. So we not only try to innovate internally, but also look at additional partnerships to bring us new ideas and then help them help them become reality. Yeah, Stan, we have a lot of strategic partnerships. Well, we recognize we can't do it alone. We need partners when we need them. We need to work with communities everywhere we go. You know, stakeholder understanding stakeholder needs and requirements is always part of what we do. So,
Company called AECOM. AECOM grew to about 75,000 engineers back about 5 years ago, and they began just getting bigger and bigger, and they started absorbing everything they could buy. other companies, and they came to the conclusion, nah, this is not working, because you get so big that all of a sudden your thinking you hold all the expertise gets so diluted that you can't function. So they began selling off their companies that they thought were going to be the good ones, and now they're down to about 50,000 people. They've let go. They didn't let them go. They just sold them off to other companies. But they understood that maybe too big is too big. And you got a question.
My background was in public policy before I went to the private sector. So I built coalitions of competitors. And I wanted to talk to you or get your perspective on being competitors in a commercial environment. Tell us what you think might help you in terms of policies, incentives, to enable you to build the kinds of partnerships where you can have open source sharing of new technologies, where you can accelerate the pace at which those become discovered and then deployed, and to create the kinds of partnerships that allow you to get beyond some of the stovepiping and, you're obligated to your shareholders, et cetera. Tell us what can help you from a policy perspective do that viably and sustainably. And by sustainably there, I mean over time on a continuous basis.
Sure. Well, I'll say, first of all, we're not competitors. Black & Veatch is a great partner. But what I would say just broadly is, this is a space that is large enough and our sector is fragmented enough that the broader climate resilience challenge is the definition of a pre-competitive space, right? So when you think about kind of the nature of the challenge, the thing that needs to happen is and I come back to the market failures slide, right? For there to be enough awareness and commitment and investment, that is going to drive enough growth for basically not only every incumbent in the water sector, but folks that are not in the water sector today that have a lot of work to do on infrastructure resilience. The biggest challenge is not who gets which slice of the pie, it's that the pie is a tiny fraction of what it needs to be in order to solve the challenges that we've been describing. And so from the perspective of policy, I think the thing that decision makers need to do is to send long-term market signals commensurate with the scale of the challenge. And what that will do is to drive a degree of investment into the sector that will make it possible for companies of all stripes to compete and to grow.
Thanks, Al. I agree. We're great partners, not competitors. Of course, we have competitors in the engineering world where we operate. And in general, that's a good thing, right? Competition, helps us get better. And it's good for the owners as well, so that they get the best value for what they're spending. So generally, competition I think is a good thing. We do partner as needed when we have to supplement our skills for a particular need. We do that. I think that's very common in the industry. I want to go back to really the comment I made earlier. Yuval Harari's estimate. We need to be we need a step change. We need to be spending on clean technologies, improving our infrastructure at the levels that Yuval Harari is talking about, 2% of the GDP. So when we do that, there's a lot of work for everyone. I don't think competition is going to hold us back at all. In terms of policy implications, maybe a small issue. I don't think it's a big issue. Sometimes the procurement rules can be somewhat restrictive. Sometimes that is driven by price concerns, cost concerns, right? So sometimes there is a tendency to to go for low cost proposals, low cost solutions. And I think from a policy perspective, I think it would be beneficial to the industry in general to focus on value rather than price. So qualification, if that's qualifications, company experience, or teaming, however we define value, I think cost should be part of the evaluation, but not so much. Thank you.
Give these two guys a hand.